Hello everyone and welcome back to this week's episode of AdvoChats. You're joined by me, Akhila and Randeniya, and we have here today Mr. Yohan Lawrence. And we're here going to be talking about the apparel industry in Sri Lanka and the apparel industry as a whole within the globe, and how that's going to affect Sri Lanka and perhaps the way that we earn our dollars, because that was a large impact income that we had. And recently we've heard in the news, I'm assuming you guys have seen, that a big player in the apparel industry has shut down their services and one of their factories rather, and decided to relocate to elsewhere. And there was a lot of, I guess, fear created among the public, where people thought that this is the end, and a lot of I guess, catastrophizing the situation. So we brought here an expert, Mr. Yohan Lawrence, from the Joint Apparel Association, to help us better understand as to exactly what's going on and what we can expect as Sri Lankans and as to what will happen. So Mr. Lawrence, is there anything you'd like to start us off with?
Sure. So let me give you a bit of an overall picture of where we are. So if you take currently, if you take, let's say, the last 7 months, we've started seeing a decline in apparel exports. Our exports are primarily to the USA, the UK, and the EU. Those three markets account for around 85% of what we do. Right. And we've seen, because we've seen it coming, obviously, because as orders, orders are placed well ahead. So it's something we've seen coming, that as those markets have gone into contraction for their own reasons, that therefore filters back into a reduction on demand for countries like ourselves. So I think the first one to kind of put out there is the fact that this is really not a domestic issue. This is an international issue that is affecting all apparel exporting countries. So right. To give you a bit of context, if you take apparel exports to the US, or if you look at it the other way, imports into the US of apparel, in the first quarter of this year, they were down by 20-something% compared to the same period last year. So that reduction is there from the global demand perspective. Right. We're seeing similar issues in EU and the UK as well, for different reasons. The US is largely dependent on the fact that post-COVID there was a large increase in orders that were placed. So actually 2022 was the industry's best year in a long time. Right. So, and that really signified kind of buying that was caught up post-COVID. But I think what wasn't expected was a contraction in the economies there, particularly the US increase in interest rates, slowing of the economy, and that has meant that people just aren't buying the product. So therefore, the suppliers, the stores are holding large amounts of inventory, and therefore that has a knock-on effect. Right. So if you take the US again, as I said, we see that 20%, and Sri Lanka's exports to the US are down by about 20%. The US is our single biggest market. It's about 40% of what we do. So it's a big piece. But that impact is happening right across the supply chain. So whether you're a Bangladesh, a Vietnam, a China, or a Cambodia, any of the apparel exporting countries into the US are all seeing declines, and those declines average out at about 20%, because that's the way it falls. And Sri Lanka kind of sits right there. So I think that's the first one to put out, that this is kind of related to a factor that's completely outside of us. That does make it difficult to do something about, because if it's a reduction in exports due to either some policy locally or something, then we have the opportunity to take that up with the authorities and come up with solutions and to reason. So this one is one that's a little more difficult. Just taking that thought a little further, if you look at the EU and the UK, there our reductions are slightly smaller, but there you see a slight difference, because in those markets, countries particularly like Bangladesh are actually doing much better. Okay. Now the rationale for that is that, the European and UK and Europe economies are also going into recession. The fallout from the Russia-Ukraine war, the rise in inflation is, we were talking to one of the big brands and saying the issue is the customer just has less money in their wallet to purchase clothing, and therefore they have to buy clothing as cheap as they can, right, because price is king. And unfortunately with the UK and the EU, unlike Sri Lanka, Bangladesh's apparel exports, because they're an LDC and come under the everything but arms category means that all of their products are duty free into those markets.
Right.
Whereas Sri Lanka has, whether it's the EU's GSP Plus or the UK's DCTS schemes, have certain restrictions on rules of origin. And what that means is that into those markets, it's generally only about 50% of what we export that actually qualifies for duty-free status. So in that position, when the customer is looking to buy at the lower price, because they have to sell goods at a lower price, then the purchase price is vital, and therefore that's a landed price that's important, not an ex-factory price.
Right.
So when we don't have the duty concession, then we lose out. So in that sense, we're losing out in those markets a little bit more than we are. The US is seeing a fairly static reduction across all the countries. There are some odd variations, but essentially that's where we are.
Right. Okay. So just like you spoke about how Bangladesh and they have their agreements and whatnots that allow them to get a competitive advantage. Mr. Lawrence, in your experience, do you think, or in your opinion, do you think that the crisis that we had and the forex problems that we had, whether that in any way made Sri Lanka less competitive in the international scheme, or was it always just something that was not, the apparel industry was something that was sublime to it?
So I think sublime may be going too far, but as I said, if you take 2022, our exports of apparel in 2022 was nearly just under 6 billion, which was as high as it.
Yes.
And that's having seen a decline from kind of, I think, October onwards.
Right.
So in terms of Sri Lanka's own economic crisis and forex crisis and so on, it didn't have a direct impact per se, because of the fact that I think there was a recognition, as there was during the COVID time, that industries need to function, they need to operate. Exports are a key part of the country's, one of the big pillars of foreign exchange earnings. And therefore, even with the exchange control restrictions and so on, for companies who were wanting to purchase raw materials for conversion, import raw materials for conversion, there was no issue. So we still continued to operate. During the fuel crisis time, we had the arrangements to purchase fuel in dollars. So there was a lot that was done within the infrastructure in Sri Lanka to make sure that the industry kept working. And as a result, we were able to keep ourselves insulated from some of those impacts.
Right. Okay. And so what I'm hearing from what you just said is that the 1 billion reduction that has been stated around and the number that's been thrown around is a reduction from one of the highest earning years that the apparel industry has seen?
That's correct. So if you took 2022, it was 5.6, 5.7, somewhere there. And if you say we're currently tracking at a 20% reduction, if that continues on till the end of December, then calendar year 2023, you would see a reduction of around 1 billion.
Right.
Now, we are hopeful that it won't go until December. Right now, as where we sit at the end of May, it's certainly going to carry on for the next 4 months, but hopefully we might see some things pick up. But yeah, if the current trend of the last 6 or 7 months continues out to the end of the year, and that's arguably not an unrealistic hypothesis, then yes, you would see a reduction of around a billion.
Right. So in comparison, so let's say approximately it is about 5.6 billion, you say, and with that billion or 20% reduction for the rest of this calendar year, how would that track in terms of historical trends over the years? Is that a large dip? Is that about average, or
so we, for another exercise the other day, we looked at apparel exports since they started, which is kind of like 1977, 78 when the economy opened. And if you look at that graph, it's constantly upwards, but it has its big dips and downs. The biggest, of course, was COVID. COVID was a massive hit. So this would certainly not be as big as the COVID hit, but it would be one of the bigger shocks. I mean, right through the history, whether it was, JVP insurrections, whether it was LTT issues, whether it was central bank bombing, whether, all of these things, and or global factors, economic crisis and so on, you kind of see this trend that keeps doing this.
Right.
This one is going to be big. if it carries on, it is. It is not as bad as COVID, but it is going to be big.
Right. Okay. So, what can Sri Lanka or the apparel industry do to to soften the blow, if at all anything?
So I think there are two things that we need to look at. One is in terms of externally.
Okay.
So right now, other than the EU and the UK's schemes, Sri Lanka doesn't have preferential market access to anywhere of any significance, whereas a lot of our competitors do. So this is something we've been proponents of free trade agreements for a long time.
Yes.
We see the FTAs of India and China being absolutely critical that we get these past the finish post operational. We're also saying that Sri Lanka should look. There is discussion about joining RCEP and so on. These things need to be expedited because what we find is that a lot of our competitors all have some form of preferential market access. So this is no longer something which is being given to as a kind of a help. This is now an equalizer. So
right. Okay.
And there are some low-hanging fruit that we should be looking at, and this is what the focus of our discussions with government authorities are. So, for example, if you take India, right now we operate under something called the ISFTA, whereby we have a limit, unfortunately, of 8 million pieces of apparel in any particular year. Beyond that, it's free, it's liable for duty, but up to 8 million, there is a quota.
Right.
Bangladesh, by contrast, has completely open access to India on a duty-free basis. And the thing is that our volumes are very, very small. So on the global scale, Sri Lanka is at best 1.5% of global apparel trade. So, if we were to double, it's really not going to give anybody it's not going to be an issue to anybody,
right,
because, as I said again, we are 5-point-something billion. Bangladesh is 35 or 40, right, Vietnam is 35, 40. So these are giants. As I said, we could double and still not make a dent. Yeah. So that is something that we feel is absolutely key. So there's India and China, because we started. We really want for those to get to the past the finish post as soon as possible, so that those would then give us some entry into those markets. India and China are both reasonable markets for Sri Lanka, and again, with the amount of branded product that is made in Sri Lanka, it offers brands an opportunity to get into those markets, and that will have automatic multiplier effects in terms
it is a knock-on effect.
So that's in terms of the external front of what we can do. The internal one, what we can do, and again, these are discussions that we're having, is that at the time of COVID, what we all agreed, employees, employers, unions, government, everybody agreed that the key was to protect employment.
Yes.
And at that time, we came up with this scheme whereby companies didn't have to lay people off. They could keep them on their books. They could not call them in to work. They could pay them a reduced wage, and then when things picked up, they came in.
Right.
As you probably know, Sri Lanka is currently looking at a reform of its labor law. We think this is long overdue. And this kind of flexibility, this kind of furlough schemes is absolutely vital, because if we are to, the important thing is we need to make sure we're ready to produce when things pick up, because they will. Markets go up, markets come down. What is absolutely key is that when they pick up, we're ready. We are ready, and this is why, again, in the instance that you talked about at the start of the program of the company that was temporarily closing an operation, you'll see that the commentary is particularly the machine operators, the team member grade would all get absorbed into the business, because what they don't want to do is lose it. So that kind of flexibility is needed. If Sri Lanka is to face these shocks, and if you look back historically, again, if you look at the graph of our growth, as I said, since the 70s, it's continuously up and down. So there are shocks. Some of them are internal, some of them are external, that we're going to have to deal with. And it's absolutely vital that we have a set of labor laws that allow us to do that. And we're incredibly pleased that the government is looking at this. We've made, and all of the indications are that these sort of things will be looked into, where we have that flexibility, which then protects both parties, because it keeps the employee in work, and at the same time it also reduces the burden on the employer. And then when the time is right, they can come in and pick back up. So this is something that is going to be crucial for Sri Lanka generally. It's going and it's something that we can't wait for that kind of legislation to come in. So those are the two big takeaways, I think, in terms of what's going to happen.
Right. So to summarize it, if I may, initially it would be externally if Sri Lanka could gain access to better access to markets,
Yeah.
international markets, and if we can make sure that our labor laws are primed in a way to allow more flexibility in, I'm assuming, both the employer and the employee.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, if you look at that, there's a number of there's a whole scheme of things. There's all sorts of flexible things that need to come in.
Yes.
Right now, we don't really recognize this concept of seasonal work and being able to employ people for a short period and then not have them and then bring them back on another contract and have the labor department say, no, hang on, that's a continuous contract. You have to have this sort of flexibility so that when there is work, when there is stuff, you can do that, and then one times when they're lean, you can wean off. This happens. This is the same thing that's needed even in the hotel industry, because you have seasonal demand, and you want to be able to have a pool of people who you can safely employ on a contract for the peak months. You tell them, sorry, but this is the season, I can't give you work in this period.
Right.
So you have to be able to have that flexibility. Then people will stay within the industry, and they'll know that this happens, and we'll adjust for it. That will allow trained people to stay within, and this is the same argument that we have, because when we want to start up, we don't want to start up with people who we have to train from scratch.
Right. Yes.
So that ability to be flexible in that context, to have people, and as you say, it serves both the employer and the employee, because at a time like this, protection of employment is absolutely key, given everything that Sri Lanka has gone through.
Yeah.
The last thing we want is to have factories closing and people being out of work. We have to accept that in the current context, we can't say that's not going to happen. There will be something, but we have to try and see how we minimize that, whilst keeping us prepared for being able to build back when things pick up.
Right. So is it wrong if I am to say that this contraction of the apparel industry of sorts is not necessarily a bad thing, because it allows Sri Lanka and the government and the industry as a whole to sort of revitalize itself and revamp itself into a position for when things pick up, whether it's seasonal or global economic contractions, that we are at a juncture where reforming external factors to the apparel industry and other industries, of course, like you stated, that we are at a prime junction for reformation of I guess, legislation or just attitudes in general or business practices to make us a more competitive element in the global industry.
Completely. I mean, we've had lots of crises, and as we've all heard, we should never let a good crisis go to waste. And it is unfortunate. I mean, but we've seen this. Whenever there is a contraction of demand, companies will then take stock of where they are. They will look at their footprint. They will look at what fat there is in the system. They will look at how they become leaner and meaner. So companies are forced, because of this contraction, to look internally at their business and restructure themselves. So absolutely. I mean, it is unfortunate that we had to do this post the Easter bombing. We had to do it post COVID. So, at a point where you've had like 5-6 years of good growth and so on. But yeah, it is an opportunity, and it is something that we are seeing, that people will look at that and say, well, hang on a second, this factory in this place doesn't make sense. It's not competitive, and we need to do something. So yeah, it is an opportunity right now for that, and as I said, it's just unfortunate that comes off the back of two other opportunities in the last 3 years.
So I mean, better late than never.
True.
And just out to the audience, I'd like to remind you guys that we are always open for questions. You can type in the chat, and we are more than willing to answer them to the best of our abilities. So with that being said, Mr. Lawrence,
Yohan, please.
So sorry, Yohan. The apparel industry, what is the future like the way we titled it? Barring the unfortunate where the reduction continues and the projected 20% stays on, what does the future look like in the event that it does not?
So I think there will so the big question is when it reverts, will it go all the way back up to where it was, or will
Right.
it? There's a piece of me that says that if you look at, because again we're comparing this to 2022, where
Right.
demand was possibly unusually high in the post-COVID period. So we have to prepare ourselves for the fact that it might not get back to that level.
Okay.
It might. Okay. But where does that leave us? I think that still leaves us as a competitive force. Sri Lanka brings a lot to the table. As a small player on the global scale, we offer something that is really quite unique to the customer. So it's not just the simple action of apparel, it's the from product design to innovations to development to warehousing to dispatch. We've over the years we've built we've widened the amount of the supply chain that we cover.
Right.
Into that, you have Sri Lanka's good record of good manufacturing practices. You have Sri Lanka's outstanding ESG records. You have the fact that people are investing in sustainable energy. People are doing the things to reduce their carbon footprint. So there's a lot of good things that are happening in the industry, and those things are recognized. I mean, and therefore Sri Lanka will always have that place.
Right.
It's never going to be. It's no longer going to be the cheap place to make. That ship has sailed. Again, factories in Bangladesh and China and so on are much bigger than us. We just don't have the scale.
Right.
So we can't, even in good times, we can't compete purely on price.
Right.
It's just not possible. The economics doesn't
It doesn't add up.
It doesn't add up. So we have to find, and we have continued to find something which is going to continue to draw people into Sri Lanka.
Okay.
And this is why you see, I mean, there's a lot of chatter about, Sri Lankan companies investing overseas and so on. So here's the thing. We need to offer customers as much as we can in a basket. So when they talk to company X, who is a Sri Lanka-based company, they need to know that they're not limiting themselves to a slightly higher production base of small factories in Sri Lanka. They need to know that customer needs to know that by talking to this supplier in Sri Lanka, he also has access to pricing out of Bangladesh, out of a large factory that gives him duty-free benefits into his market, that he has access to a factory somewhere in Africa because that country has preferential agreements with the US. So the fact that companies are setting up overseas, that is the way that we will have to exist, because just as much as a small company on its own cannot exist in the market today, a big local business that is based purely in Sri Lanka cannot compete, because the customer will say, well, that's fine, but I'll just come for you for the piece of the goods where I want the thing that's from us, made in a sustainable factory, made using all of these. So you have all of those things happening. So Sri Lanka will continue to offer that, and as I said, that is why you would have factories, Sri Lankan companies investing in factories outside. We also need to look that at the end of the day, we have to make sure that Sri Lanka is the right place for investment. There's a big piece around that. Because the question is, if an investor had $1 million to invest in an apparel factory, would that investor come to Sri Lanka? And the extension of that argument is, if an existing Sri Lankan manufacturer had $1 million to invest, would they invest in Sri Lanka? So Sri Lanka has to make itself competitive. It has to make itself attractive. The ease of doing business we know in Sri Lanka is a problem.
Right.
And
Definitely.
this does not attract investment, whether it's externally, whether it's an investment from an FDI or whether it's domestic investment from a Sri Lankan company. So that piece is there, and we can't ignore that piece, that we have to make Sri Lanka has to be genuinely investor friendly. It has to be the place that it has to be the preferred destination for the investors' dollars, and that's not just apparel. That's any manufacturing sector. If we are not offering the investor the biggest bang for his buck, he or she is going to take his investment somewhere else.
Right. So I guess we need to incentivize investors to come into Sri Lanka more, and just like you said, so it's twofold, is it not? Locally, I guess what we can do and what we can control is to have better labor laws, laws that incentivize people to take up employment in these industries, but also allow the employer to, I guess, seasonally hire people. And on top of that, like you stated, it would be better if we can work on our foreign relations in a way that we can have access to markets and better markets.
I think one other, the ease of doing business is not, the labor law is one part of it.
Right.
The ease of doing business includes, how easy is it to set up a business? How easy is it actually, can you go to one place and get all your approvals? Or are you going to get sent from pillar to post? Are
Right.
you going to have, when you set up a factory, are you going to have political interference coming in? We've seen, we've seen issues like this that have happened in the past. When you go, are you sure that the land you're going to buy is definitely, or invest in is definitely yours, and that, so many years later down the road, somebody else is not going to come. So it's this whole ease of doing business.
Right.
It also goes into things like, have we got the right tax structures? Have we got the right governance systems in place? So
Right.
these are the things, when somebody invests, it's not just, what is the price I can get out of the factory? Is my investment safe? Can I put my money in? Can I take my money out? Am I investing in a country that is governed well, that is where the rule of law is respected? So these are all important markers in the ease of doing business. And Sri Lanka doesn't, I think in the global ease of doing business, I think we're 99 out of 199 or something like
Yes,
that.
I believe so.
Where we're certainly not where we should be. And
Definitely.
you can see the number of instances where that comes through in practice. So
Right.
these are the areas that we have to work on.
So I guess while the apparel industry was insulated to, I guess, the difficult times of, the fuel crisis, the economic crisis, and, certain extent, I guess, COVID as well, it's not immune to the general business conditions that
not.
exist in Sri Lanka.
Absolutely not. It is, the whole, what is happening in Sri Lanka, where, it has a massive impact. So
Definitely, right. So I think we've talked our audience's ear off with the extent of the apparel industry, and I think we've also learned as to how general business and how the economic conditions in Sri Lanka need to be improved for not only the apparel industry but for business in general and to get investment in general. So I'd like to thank you, Yohan, for your time today, and I'd like to thank just on that note, we have a question, Johan. Would you mind answering it? Okay. So this individual would like to know about the new EU bill on sustainable source manufacturing and whether Sri Lankan medium enterprises can be up to this game, and is there a way Sri Lanka can plug the ASEAN fashion supply chain rather than catering only to the West?
Okay, so let me take the first half of that about sustainable supply. So I think what this is referring to is there is a law in Germany, the Due Diligence Supply Chain Act, which is already in place, and the EU has regulations that's coming behind that. And what these regulations call on you is basically to make sure that you have the right set of protocols in running your business in terms of social and environmental. And this is something Sri Lanka can use to its advantage because we are, and even the SME factories to the greater part are able to get this. So this is something that we should be leveraging on to our advantage. The interesting thing about this type of regulation is that right now it's very sketchy as to what you need to do to actually comply. So if you take the German law, it's basically telling you of things you need to do, but kind of how you prove that, because on the whole sustainability side, it's more difficult to, you don't have a standard, you don't have a thing. So, but the level of compliance in Sri Lankan factories is such that we don't see this as a disadvantage at all. We see it as an advantage.
Okay, that's great.
The second part about looking east, it is something we do need to do, and this is why I mentioned China, because China, if we can get access, all of these markets depend on access, because if we don't have access to them at a decent rate of duty, then we're caught out. So this is where we need to look at where these work, and this is why we need to look at things like RCEP, which would then open up the supply of apparel into a whole host of other countries, all on this side of the world.
So one more final question, Johan. So Priyanthi Fernando wants to know, will the better labor laws address some of the human rights violations that we know are perpetrated by, for instance, manpower agencies that work with some of these companies? So maybe human rights violations is a bit of a stretch, but I guess exploitative practices that may be occurring?
So let's look at manpower.
Right.
Okay? Why are there manpower agencies? Because of two things. Employers want occasions where they want to have labor for a short period.
Right.
an employee is want some flexibility where they only want to work 3 days a week because they have an aged mother at home, or they want. So quite honestly, our approach, this is one of the reasons we are pushing this, because if you had that flexibility in law, you wouldn't need to have a manpower agency.
Right.
So we have to accept that, you know, people go to manpower agencies because they want that flexibility, because they only want to work for a certain number of days or a certain hours or a certain, you know, only for a month or something. And we have to have that. And if we had the ability to bring those people into the business in the normal manner, so they get covered by all of the businesses activities, get the benefits of the business, then automatically the need for manpower people would move out.
Right.
The other one also, just on manpower, is that the manpower issue is the biggest use of it is particularly in Karnataka zone.
Okay.
Our industry has moved, a lot of our industry has moved out of Karnataka zone. So we employ 350,000 people, give or take.
Okay.
I think in Karnataka zone there's about 12,000.
Right.
So yes, it is an issue that happens around Karnataka because of shortage of labor and so on. But again, if you had this flexibility, and this is why our factories have all moved, the greater part have all moved out of zones, and they've moved to the Vavunias, the Kilinochis, the Anuradhapuras of this country, so that you have access to that labor, and people can come into work from being at home.
So there's a follow-up, which is to say that labor laws, so the newer labor laws will eliminate these manpower agencies. So if I could answer that, Yohan, and not put you in too much of hot water, I guess essentially yes, because if the entire existence of this middleman is the lack of flexibility and the lack of protections that are afforded to both, correct me if I'm wrong anywhere here, Yohan, a lack of flexibility from either end of the parties, or the lack of protections that are available, if legally we're, as a state, we're able to afford these protections to these people, allowing them to take part in flexible work, and on both ends, you know, hiring and taking part in this work, perhaps then yes, the better protections would minimize the need for individuals to go into these manpower agencies, and therefore, you know, go through exploitation that people speak of, you know, and the troubles that these individuals have to go of.
Yeah, I'll just touch one more because I know we're conscious of time, but also the other part of labor law is also making sure we have the correct social security network that comes into place. So this is not just about flexible working, this is about offering a completely different model where you also have that better social protection. That will encourage people to come out of the informal sector and into the formal. We have to do this because as long as people are in the informal sector, and in my view, the manpower workers are informal in that respect, they're out of, they fall out of the social security nets, they don't get, so we have to address this. And this is why this is key, because if we make these reforms and we sort out the social security net, then we will automatically attract people into the industry. Employers will be willing to take people in, knowing that they can take them in only for a part-time or so on. So it is a win-win, and will it take manpower people out? I don't know, but it would certainly, I think it would certainly reduce the number of, the amount of work in that sense.
Right. Seeing as that we've run out of questions from our great audience, I'd like to thank you, Yohan, for coming onto our show and helping us better understand, the way that the news cycle works. Because, we saw these numbers being thrown around and, contraction going on. And I guess it left a bunch of people very worried as to what the future holds, especially when, the apparel industry was seen as a big source of forex income. So I hope that we helped alleviate a lot of problems our audience had. And if you'd like to see more content like this, please follow us on all our social media. So once again, Mr. Yohan, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
And Akhila and Randeniya, thank you for watching.